couple weeks ago, California signed a new law into effect, as they occasionally do, and shortly after that, a rumor went out that Glock was going to pull production of almost every single model that they have, and with a couple of exceptions. Now, since then, Glock has confirmed that this rumor is at least partly true. They are canceling the production of almost every Glock that you know, the 17, the 19, things that have been around for 40 years are now stopped, and new models are coming. However, I don't believe that this is just because of California. The internet was very quick to jump to conclusions, pull out their pitchforks, but I'm convinced that there's something else going on. So let's go back a couple of weeks to California. They filed and then passed and then signed into law California Assembly Bill 1127, which outlaws pistols that can readily be converted into fully automatic using devices like this. And it's basically Glock. The law is targeted very much at Glock's current production handguns because Glock switches like this are showing up in crime scenes. Now, if you look at the data, they show up in a lot of crime scenes, but sometimes the data isn't clear. Is the switch showing up at a crime scene because people got shot? Is the switch showing up at a crime scene because people got shot at? Or is the switch showing up at a crime scene because a boxcar full of Glock switches from China is in and of itself a crime scene, according to the ATF? Hard to say how big of an issue these actually are, but there is pretty fascinating security camera footage of Glock switch-equipped Glocks doing stuff in the neighborhoods of Chicago and Los Angeles. So a number of states have wanted to crack down on this. And that's where we get to Glock specifically. Glock is being targeted because they are the biggest target in this space of handgun manufacturers, and because the Glock switch is a legendary implement lauded in song and mostly security camera footage. But there's a little bit more to this story than just Glock capitulating to a state like California. I want you, if you're interested in the legal side, to go watch a video by James Reeves, because not only has Glock been singled out by this particular California law that goes into effect next year, they are currently involved in several lawsuits. They're being sued by various jurisdictions, states, and cities because their handguns are too dangerous, because their handguns are easy to modify. And they're on the hook for about a dozen potential more lawsuits that have been threatened by different cities and different states. So when you look at a dozen major lawsuits from some of the bigger and more powerful states and cities in the country, that is probably what is provoking some of these changes, more than just a desire to hang on to California as a market for their specific pistols. Again, James Reeves lays out the legal side. He's a lawyer and I am not, so I just want to talk about the principle of the thing. What is happening is people are using handguns to commit crimes. Crimes of murder, crimes of attempted murder, crimes of reckless endangerment. And instead of the people actually perpetrating those actions, the different jurisdictions, these different cities, Chicago for one, these different states, California for one, are going after the manufacturer of the tool and not the person wielding it. But now they're going even further. They're going after not just the tool being misused, but the tool that has the potential to be modified. And this is a very dangerous precedent because every semi-automatic weapon contains a fully automatic weapon waiting to get out. This is something that people have said, don't share this around too widely, but that is fundamentally how these mechanisms work. Any firearm that can automatically load and fire a single cartridge has the mechanical capability to do it more than once. That's just built into the mechanism. And there's usually a mechanism that stops it from happening more than once. That is fundamental to the design of semi-automatic auto-loading firearms, and there's nothing that you can do about it. If it can do that, then it can do the other thing. And the only question is how hard it is to modify. So demanding that anything that can be misused be banned, or anything that could be modified to be misused slightly more efficiently be banned, is kind of ridiculous. It would be like saying this hammer should be controlled because it could be used to kill people. Fun fact, Hammers actually kill more people than AR-15s, but AR-15s get more legislation than hammers. But this is going even further. This is like saying this hammer needs to be banned because somebody could turn this thing into a tomahawk. These kinds of modifications are not just something that only criminals might do or things that are completely unthinkable. This is just basic technology. Hammers and tomahawks have basically the same physics involved. Semi-automatic and fully automatic weapons have the same mechanisms involved. So not understanding these basic things and then in conjunction applying the same basic presuppositions that we can take away all weapons that might possibly be misused in order to prevent misuse from happening. These two things together are a big problem. And then, of course, the question is, where do you stop? Is the ATF going to ban long-barreled rifles because inside every long-barreled rifle is a short-barreled rifle waiting to get out? I mean, all of these modifications are doable and simple, and you could just go on and on. Every semi-automatic weapon could be converted to a fully automatic weapon, but every bolt-action rifle could be converted to a semi-automatic rifle. At the beginning of the 20th century, lots of people were doing that. Every breech-loading rifle could be modified into a magazine-fed bolt-action rifle. Every muzzle-loading rifle could be modified into a breech-loading rifle. And every pipe could be modified into a muzzle-loading firearm. So where exactly do you stop on this quest to get rid of everything that could potentially be misused or could potentially be modified to be misused in several other different potential ways? Every piece of metal could potentially be made into a fully automatic firearm with enough time and know-how. Remember, the biggest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing us that the slippery slope didn't exist. But it's not a fallacy, folks. The slippery slope is just basic physics, like firearms. So getting back to Glock, the internet jumped to the conclusion that Glock was capitulating, that Glock was licking the jackboots of California thugs because they were so desperate to maintain their military contracts, police contracts, or even just civilian sales to California. And there is some reason to believe that. California, despite passing these terrible laws, has a huge number of conservative and a huge number of gun purchasing citizens. Remember, California has a fair amount of money. You need that to purchase guns. It has a fair amount of crime. That also usually drives a lot of gun sales. But California is not controlled by Democrats because they outnumber conservatives 10 to 1. It's controlled by Democrats because they have an extra 10% or so on top of the Republicans that live there. So T-Rex Arms sells more product to California than any other state, despite the laws that exist. Texas is a close second, and then it's on down the list based on population with some modifiers based on gun friendliness. So obviously California represents a pretty big market for Glock. However, Glock has already been excluded from selling product to Californians in a significant way. Their standard capacity magazines are not allowed, and most of their handguns are barred from sale, not because they're unsafe specifically, but because they haven't been added to the not unsafe exemption list. And thanks to this new ruling, 1127, or this new law, 1127, no Glocks of the current manufacturer can be sold. But again, I don't think it's just California. The threat of these significant lawsuits from so many different places, focused so very specifically on all of Glock's existing models, have kind of forced Glock into this position. The California market is big, but it's not big enough to offset the cost of all of these things. There has to be another thing going on, and I think it is the threat of these lawsuits. The fact that being in 12 separate lawsuits with the attorney generals and district attorneys of Chicago and California and other major cities and other major states, these constant attacks on every single model of firearm that they currently produce is really, really difficult. And so they have made an equally difficult decision to take all of those off the production line and come out with something new, the Model V. The Model V name kind of bugs me because we already have Gen 5, and we have yet to see what changes are going to be made to the gun. But I believe that Glock is facing an existential threat from these lawsuits, Glock USA anyway, and I imagine that they probably came to the same conclusion and this was their solution. But there's a second issue that Glock now faces. The problem that Glock is now going to run into is the internet. Not only has the internet jumped to a bunch of conclusions about Glock's appreciation for the Second Amendment based on this decision that came out last week. We appreciate Glocks on the internet, the gun community, the gun industry. We appreciate Glocks because of reliability and aftermarket support. If Glock is being forced to change internal parts so that they no longer function with these very simple external parts, it's going to be very hard for them to convince the market that these new parts, this new internal mechanism is as reliable, as good as the old one. And the aftermarket support is going to be largely gotten rid of. We know that the trigger mechanism is going to change, so aftermarket triggers for Gen 5 Glocks will not be compatible in the Model V. I also have an assumption that if they continue to have good reliability, there is a great option for aftermarket support, which means that new Glock switches, new forced reset triggers will be available probably like 5 minutes after the Model V actually becomes available. And now Glock is in this other very awkward position. The core value of Glock, if you go back and watch our original video on the history of Glock, the core value of Glock that they brought to the table was simplicity and reliability, which they got from removing as many parts as possible from the action of the gun and making those parts as fault tolerant as possible. Now there's a side effect to that. If you design a gun that is extremely simple and extremely fault tolerant, it's very easy for people to make third-party parts that are compatible with that platform. A complicated and finicky platform doesn't take aftermarket parts. So now that Glock is being told, not by the market, not by their engineers, not by anybody inside of the gun industry, but they're being told by the district attorneys and prosecutors of other states that they must change their design so that it is more finicky and more complicated and less aftermarket friendly. We're not really sure exactly what is going to happen. Now, it could be that we trust Glock enough, or there are enough customers of Glock that it just continues on regardless of what the internet says. One of the things that T-Rex has learned this year is that the internet and real life are more separate than even we thought. But times have indeed changed. I remember back in 2006 when Glock 40 caliber pistols were exploding, and that didn't actually stop people from buying Glocks. Didn't even stop people from buying 40 caliber Glocks. Didn't even stop me from buying a 40 caliber Glock. I got a police trade-in that had not exploded. I assumed that it was going to continue not exploding, and I carried it for years. But things are different now. In the year 2025, people are a lot pickier, and it's going to be very hard for Glock to convince us, its market share, that a significant change to the trigger system or the sear or other internal components hasn't been rushed and isn't going to be something like, say, a SIG P320 situation. Those of us who trust Glock because of 40 years of track record with some of these very specific models, 1917, etc., we're going to have to be convinced that the new mechanisms, the new mechanical internals are in fact reliable and they are in fact fault tolerant. But even then, that still leaves us without aftermarket support until that grows for the new product line. So my sympathy for Glock is now twofold. Number one, they're being unfairly persecuted and prosecuted and sued and pursued by all these different jurisdictions for bad precedent reasons and just political spite. And then number two, they're being put in a position where two of their greatest strengths are being taken away from them, and they will have to prove that they still have those. Now, there is a silver lining here, and this is something that we talked about in the history of Glock video. Even if Glock USA or Glock Germany, even if those companies fail to weather this storm, Glock as a platform still exists. In many ways, the Gen 3 Glock is the pinnacle of Glock engineering, in my opinion, and the Gen 3 Glock is being maintained as a platform by many, many third-party manufacturers. If Glock is forced to go down this path of making weapons that are expensive to develop, not fully trusted by the market, only purchased by law enforcement because Glock has fulfilled the requirements, etc., etc., you will still be able to get Glock-style weapons that support the Glock aftermarket parts that you like and prefer. It could be that the Glock platform is now in the hands and being well stewarded by not Glock, but Shadow Systems, PSA, Zev, the countless other people who are building Glock spare parts and even complete Glock Gen 3 style weapons. So not only do you have tons and tons of polymer frame, striker fire, double stack Wonder 9s from every other manufacturer, you're still going to be able to get Glock platform Glocks, even if you can't get Glock company Glocks. It's a silver lining in a dark cloud, but it does, I think, help us establish this as a platform. About a year ago, we made a video where we talked about the future of Glock without Gaston. What could they do as a company? On the one hand, they could lean very heavily into preserving the legacy, documenting all the engineering of the past, building a museum, publishing historical books, hiring some writers to really document this process and publicize it. Or lean super heavily into R&D, putting a huge amount of focus on really advanced blue sky experimentation with caseless ammo and really futuristic stuff. Either of these two options would allow them to highlight the incredible change to the industry that they brought 40 years ago. But now, California, Chicago, various other politically motivated municipalities are forcing Glock to take neither approach. They have to throw away all of their legacy internals and switch to something new, and they're going to have to spend a huge amount of time working on building something that is comparable, not building something that is significantly bigger and better and more advanced and influential in the future. So my hope is that Glock is able to weather this because they're a much bigger victim here than you probably originally thought. I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of conservatives in California, and they have significantly less political power than you would assume. It's just a very interesting thing when you look at the numbers. There's a lot of talk about gerrymandering right now. The Democrats really want to make sure that Republicans don't gerrymander. But if you look at California, let's say we look at the last presidential election, almost 40% of Californians voted for Donald Trump, a bizarre New Yorker, the natural enemy of Californians, as opposed to a fellow Californian. So at least 40% of Californians, I would say, fit in the Republican bucket. But if you look at their legislature, which continues to pass legislation like 1127, banning firearms, banning standard capacity magazines, things like that, Republicans only have 25% of the seats because of the gerrymandering. And then if you look at who California actually elects to send to Washington, the numbers get even worse. There are currently only 17% Republicans that are elected by those 40% Republican voters to go to Washington. And that number is about to get worse if California is able to pass Proposition 50. Prop 50 is going to change the voting districts yet again to make things more fair and more democratic. With the new projected layouts, California will have 40% Republicans, and all of those ballots will only allow them to elect 7% Republican representation and send them to the federal Congress. So 40% of the people will be allowed to have 7% of a voice. This is why local politics is extremely important, and we talk about that a lot. Even in states like California, where it looks like a lot of ground has been lost, there's a lot of ground that could be regained.